We're looking today at Psalm 30. Life has its ups and downs, and the psalmist, this one's attributed to David, the psalmist is very clear about those ups and downs. He's certainly experienced some in his life, and quite recently as he writes the psalm. He doesn't tell us which particular ups and downs these are, and if it is David, there are quite a number in his life. We know a fair bit of his history. He certainly had his ups and his downs. Some of them were his own problem and his own making in terms of things that went wrong. Some were people in opposition to him because they didn't want him as king. They didn't want him to succeed Saul or to replace Saul, even though God had chosen him for that. So there are lots of ups and downs in David's life. We don't need to worry about which particular ones we're talking about here, just to observe that they're there and they're real. But David is a man of God, and he sees ups and downs in life in terms of his relationship with God, very, very much so. I will extol you, O Lord, for you have drawn me up and did not let my foes rejoice over me. Lord my God, I cried to you for help and you have healed me. So he sees his coming up. You've brought up my soul from Sheol, which the place of death, restored me to life from among those gone down to the pit. He sees his coming up in life, his restoration to joy or to peace or to good family relationships or whatever it is, or to good health. He sees all that as God's doing. But it's not just the ups he sees as God's doing, and this is where it gets tricky, and we have to be quite careful how we put things. In verse 4, sing praises to the Lord, O you his faithful ones. He wants everyone to join him in praising God. For his anger is but for a moment. His favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may linger for the night, but joy comes with the morning. He's seeing his downs as in some way a reflection of God's anger, God's punishment, God's justice. Now we have to be careful. The Bible is very clear that when things bad happen to us, it isn't usually God's judgment or God's punishment. It could occasionally be. There are occasions, and there were a couple of real occasions like that in David's life, but that's not normally the case. The psalm is not teaching us that misfortune is always a result of God's judgment. But here David tells his own story, gives his testimony. As for me, I said in my prosperity, I shall never be moved. He thought he was okay. Everything was going well for him in my prosperity. By your favor, O Lord, you'd established me as a strong mountain. You hid your face and I was dismayed. Somehow, David knew that God had withdrawn his pleasure from him. He knew that God was angry with him. God was not looking upon him. He'd hidden his face. And he was dismayed. To you, O Lord, I cried. To the Lord I made supplication. What profit is there in my death? Will the dust praise you? Hear, O Lord, be gracious to me. O Lord, be my helper. You've turned my mourning into dancing and taken off my sackcloth and clothed me with joy. Oh, that my soul may praise you and not be silent. Something very powerful here and quite mysterious and difficult, and we need to get hold of it and to interpret it aright. David was conscious that in some of his downs, some of the ways that he lost his relationship with God were God's punishment on him, God's withdrawal of favor. But on those occasions, he turns back to God and seeks God's blessing and presence and finds it. Not every time. In the first half of the psalm, Uh, he's talking about his life being brought up from Sheol when he prayed and asked God, and God restoring blessing. It doesn't say in that first half God had taken away the blessing, but there's just a hint of it second time around. Not every time by any means that we have hard times is that because God is judging. No, no, no. But whenever we're down in our relationship with God or with others or in our prayer life or in our circumstances, we can call and cry to God. It may be that he has put us down, he's turned away from us for a moment, but his anger is for a moment and his favor is for a lifetime, says David. Let's get that perspective too. But the joy of this psalm, the joy is, I've been down in the pit and you've lifted me up. And that's repeated a number of times, maybe reflecting on one situation, maybe several. I've been down and you've lifted me up. I've been down and I've cried to you and you've raised me up. I've been in the depths of misery and I've called to you and you've brought me joy and turned my morning into dancing. We all have down times. We can call to those, we can cry to those, cry to the Lord in those times. And we can know that he will lift us up. And even if it's his anger is withdrawing his favor, then we know that his anger is brief and his favor is forever. Praise God.